If you sat alone in a room for a week, no phone, no work, no people, no distractions, who would you meet? Not who would you become? Who would be sitting there on day one when the noise stopped? Would you recognize that person? Would you like them? Would you know what they want, what they feel, what they actually think when there's nobody to perform for? If those questions make you hesitate, you've just met the edge of the confrontation you've been avoiding. Everything on the other side of it is your real life. Everything on this side is the rehearsal. Jung spent his entire career mapping what lives on the other side of that edge. He called the process individuation, the slow, painful, necessary act of separating who you actually are from who you were trained to be. And he believed it was the single most important thing a human being could do, not for happiness, not for success, for the simple, terrifying experience of being alive as yourself instead of as a copy of someone else's expectations. You built your first mask before you could spell your own name. You learned which emotions were welcome and which ones made people uncomfortable. You figured out which version of you got approval and which version got silence. And you did what every child does. You kept the version that worked and buried the one that didn't. That wasn't a mistake. It was survival. A child can't afford to be rejected by the people keeping them alive. So you adapted. You shaped yourself around their reactions. You became the person the room needed you to be. But you never stopped. That's the problem. The adaptation that kept you safe at 6 is still running your life right now. The mask that was built for a child's survival became the face you show at work, in relationships, in every interaction where something is at stake. Jung called it the persona, and he warned that the longer you wear it, the harder it becomes to remember there's someone behind it. Most people never take the mask off, not because they're cowards, because they've worn it so long they think it's their skin. Here's what the mask costs you. Everything you've ever felt that didn't match the image, you buried it. Every desire that contradicted what was expected, you suppressed it. Every version of yourself that was too loud, too angry, too sad, too strange, too much, you pushed it down into what Jung called the shadow. The shadow isn't a monster, it's you, the unedited version, the one that exists before the performance starts. And it doesn't disappear when you bury it. It leaks. It leaks into the things that trigger you disproportionately. The anger that's too big for the situation. The jealousy that doesn't make sense on paper. The sadness that arrives without an invitation. It leaks into the qualities you judge hardest in other people, because they're usually the qualities you won't admit you carry. Into the exhaustion you feel after socializing, when the performance finally pauses and something underneath gasps for air. You felt that exhaustion, that specific tiredness that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got and everything to do with how long you've been pretending. That tiredness is the shadow asking you to stop. And every time you ignore it and start performing again, the distance between you and yourself gets a little wider. Finding yourself isn't what the culture sells it as. It's not a backpacking trip or a journal prompt or a personality test that sorts you into a category. Finding yourself is a confrontation, a reckoning with every adaptation you made to survive, and the slow, uncomfortable process of asking which ones are still necessary and which ones are prisons you forgot to leave. Jung described it as the most courageous act a person can perform, not because the external risks are high, because the internal ones are. When you start dismantling the persona, things fall apart. Relationships that were built on the performance start to strain. Goals that belong to someone else's definition of your life lose their pull. The certainty you had about who you are dissolves into a silence that feels like emptiness. That emptiness terrifies people. It's why most people stop. They touch the edge of it, feel the vertigo, and rebuild the old structure as fast as they can. They go back to the job, back to the routine, back to the performance that was suffocating them a week ago, but now feels like safety. They call it getting back on track. Jung would call it retreating from the only journey that matters, because the emptiness isn't empty. It just feels that way because you've never been in the room without the furniture. The roles, the masks, the identities, they filled the space so completely that you mistook the furniture for the room itself. When you remove it, what's left isn't nothing. It's space. Space you've never had. Space for whatever is actually yours to finally exist. The people who push through that emptiness describe something remarkably consistent. They don't describe finding a new identity. They describe finding a presence, a stillness underneath the noise that was always there, but couldn't be heard over the constant performance. They describe a strange simplification, the things that used to consume them, other people's opinions, the pressure to be impressive, the need to prove something. Those things get quieter, not through effort, through irrelevance. Once you've met the person underneath the masks just matter less. Not because you've risen above caring, because you've found something more real to stand on. And then something shifts externally. Not because the world changes, because you change what you bring to it. Conversations feel different when you're not managing an image. Relationships rearrange when you stop needing them to fill the gap where your identity should be. Work feels different when it's chosen by you and not by the version of you that was assembled for someone else's approval. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." He called it a privilege because it's rare, because most people will choose the performance over the confrontation every single time, because the mask is familiar and the face underneath it is a stranger, and choosing the stranger over the familiar is the hardest decision a person can make. So here's the question that matters more than any title, any achievement, any milestone you've been chasing. Do you know the person sitting underneath everything you've built? Not the roles, not the accomplishments, not the version that shows up when people are watching, the one that's there when no one is, the one that exists in that quiet room you've been avoiding. Because that person is where your life actually starts. Not the life you've been performing, the one that's been waiting behind it this whole time, patient, quiet, and more real than anything your mask has ever produced. Jung mapped the road to that person. He warned that it's not comfortable, that it requires you to face parts of yourself you've been running from, that it dismantles things you thought were permanent, that it isolates you before it connects you to something deeper. But he also said, and he meant this as literally as a person can mean anything, that until you walk that road, you haven't started living. You've been rehearsing, convincingly, exhaustingly, for years. The rehearsal can go on forever. Most people let it, but the room is still there. The person in it is still waiting, and the door has never been locked.